They found her skeleton in the summer of 2019, buried beneath a collapsed storage chamber on the outskirts of ancient Sparta, her spine twisted at an unnatural angle and her wrists pulled behind her as though even death refused to release the posture forced upon her in life. And when the archaeologists brushed away the soil, they noticed something far more disturbing than the position of her bones, the remnants of an iron ring still encircling her ankle, fused by time into the tibia itself. A ring designed not for transport or punishment, but for confinement during forced conception rituals administered by state-appointed overseers who treated Helot women as living vessels rather than human beings. The dirt around her ribs still held the faint trace of lime. Spartan midwives used it to cover the smell of blood during the breeding cycles, and beside her skull lay a broken terracotta shard inscribed with a single word in Doric Greek, a word meaning chosen, though she was never allowed to choose anything in her life. This is what Spartan leaders tried to hide. Until now, in the winter of 424 BCE, when the mountains surrounding Laconia were muffled beneath heavy clouds, and the Eurotas River carried the bitter runoff of storms, a young Helot woman named Thera, barely 17 and known in her village for the way she braided river reeds into delicate patterns, was taken from her home before dawn by 3 Spartan overseers who arrived not as raiders but as administrators fulfilling an annual state order. Their presence marked by cold efficiency rather than cruelty. Yet cruelty lived in everything they touched. Thera's mother later told neighbors that the girl moved with an eerie calm as she stepped into the mud, not because she understood her fate, but because compliance had become the closest thing Helots had to protection, though it never saved them and certainly did not save her. That was their first mistake, believing the Spartans wanted obedience when in truth the Spartans wanted lineage, bodies, and wombs they could manipulate to sustain a society built on the labor of those it dehumanized. Thera became targeted not because she resisted oppression or because she broke a law, but because her body fit the quiet calculations of the Spartan eugenic policy described centuries later by Aristotle himself, who noted with unsettling bluntness that Sparta maintained its dominance through controlled reproduction of both its warrior caste and the subjugated populations that fed it. She had broad hips, a sturdy frame, and a history of surviving childhood fevers, qualities that transformed her from a daughter into a biological asset in the eyes of men who believed the stability of the state outweighed any private sorrow inflicted along the way. Her village elders knew what her selection meant, yet no one intervened, because the law did not merely allow such seizures, it required them. Sparta's ruling council, the Gerousia, had passed decrees generations earlier granting magistrates authority to remove Helot women during specific seasons for what official tablets called genetikos nomos, the law of breeding, a phrase so clinical and deceptively neutral that it belied the brutality it sanctioned. This policy sealed Thera's fate long before she was born, ensuring that her life would serve a purpose defined by others and never herself. The transition from rumor to confirmed horror began when excavators uncovered a sealed alcove beneath the old training grounds in 2014, a chamber containing bones positioned with deliberate uniformity and inscriptions that corresponded eerily with the ancient accounts. What happened next was documented by a provincial scribe named Demonikos, and it sat hidden for almost 23 centuries. When the archivists in 2014 brushed away the soot-blackened stones of the alcove beneath the Spartan training grounds, they uncovered not just a burial chamber, but an administrative space designed with cold intentionality. Its floor etched with faint grid lines used by overseers to position the bodies of Helot women during examinations, and its walls stained with the mineral residues of ancient torches that had illuminated the suffering preserved in the scribe Demonikos' account. The room was not a sanctuary, and it was not a crypt. It was a processing station, a place where lives transformed into state assets, and the archaeologists who entered it reported a heaviness in the air, as though centuries of fear had seeped into the stone and waited patiently to be acknowledged. They found terracotta tally markers, bone needles, and a long wooden plank reinforced with bronze rivets, a device whose purpose became painfully clear when Demonikos' writings were matched to the physical evidence. And every artifact recovered reinforced something the modern scholars were reluctant to say aloud. The Spartans didn't simply control the Helots, they curated them. Demonikos himself was not a man of compassion or rebellion. He was a junior clerk assigned to observe and record the procedures for the ephors, and the surviving fragment of his logbook offers a rare window into a system designed to be untraceable. His handwriting, neat at first and increasingly erratic toward the final pages, described the selection hall where Thera and other young women were taken after their seizure. The space, as reconstructed by the archaeologists, was roughly 17 by 12 feet, with ventilation shafts carved high into the stone and an angled ceiling crafted to direct rainwater into a thin gutter that symbolically represented purification but served the more mundane purpose of washing away bodily fluids after each cycle. Demonikos noted that the stench never fully dissipated despite the use of resinous pine torches and bowls of crushed thyme, and he mentioned how the overseers accepted the smell as part of their duty, while the women trembled under the weight of expectations none of them ever agreed to fulfill. But that wasn't the worst part. The most disturbing section of Demonikos's record survived in a fragment preserved in the regional archives, a piece of parchment protected by a layer of beeswax that kept the ink starkly legible even after 23 centuries. He wrote, "They bring the women forward one by one, and the magistrate measures their hips, their stride, and the fullness of their breath as though he is judging livestock, not people. And when the girl called Thera stands before him, he nods with the satisfaction of a man who has found a solution to a problem he never intends to question." The archaeologists compared this description with faint chisel marks on the chamber wall, an outline used to measure height and posture, and confirmed that the account was not poetic exaggeration but precise technical notation. Demonikos's role was to record compliance. He never intended to document cruelty, yet his words betray a moral discomfort he dared not express overtly. Once the measurements were complete, the women were transferred through a narrow corridor into what the scribe called todromos, its sysiuos, the corridor of pairing, a name that now carries a chilling connotation because it was here that the Spartans determined which Helot women would be matched with specific males chosen not by personal preference, but by the demands of agricultural yield projections and the need to replenish labor after Messenian uprisings. This pairing corridor was reconstructed from the layout of the alcove and Demonikos's sketches, revealing a space with two dividing walls and a central platform that likely held clay tablets listing the genetic criteria used by the overseers. Modern scholars hesitate to use the term eugenic, but Aristotle himself wrote that Sparta viewed reproduction as a tool of state engineering, and when that philosophy was applied to a conquered people with no legal rights, the result resembles a chilling precursor to later systems of forced breeding. But again, that wasn't the worst part. When archaeologists from the University of Patras examined the skeletal remains of 9 women found in the alcove, they discovered signs of repeated pelvic stress consistent with multiple pregnancies in short succession, combined with healed fractures on the ribs and clavicles where restraints had pressed into the bone for prolonged periods. Dr. Leandros Maitakis, the lead osteologist, stated in a 2016 interview, "These women were used beyond the limits of survivability, and the uniformity of their injuries suggests not random violence but standardized procedure." His voice reportedly shook when he explained how the growth lines on the bones revealed malnutrition timed precisely between reproductive cycles, suggesting that Helot women were fed more generously when pregnant and starved afterward, a strategy designed to conserve resources while maximizing output. But still, that wasn't the worst part. The true horror emerged when scholars cross-referenced Demonikos's account with a later commentary by the historian Myron of Priene, who wrote in the 3rd century BCE that the Spartans maintained a hidden registry of Helot offspring to track lineage and assign roles based on strength assessments conducted shortly after birth. According to Myron, infants deemed promising were separated from their mothers within days, while others were left in the villages without acknowledgement of paternity, perpetuating the cycle of subjugation. Demonikos alluded to this in another fragment. The mothers cry when the infants are taken, yet the overseers tell them to be grateful, for a child taken by the state lives a life of purpose, while one left behind lives a life of toil, though both serve the same end. His phrasing reveals not comfort, but compliance with a system he lacked the courage to resist. But once more, that wasn't the worst part. As Demonikos spent more time observing the process, his entries grew darker and more fragmented, reflecting a man haunted by sights he was not trained to interpret yet forced to endure. He described one evening during a heavy rain when the overseers brought in a woman named Cleta, 22 years old, who had already undergone 3 breeding cycles and whose body was failing under the strain. Demonikos recorded how she collapsed during the examination, and rather than receiving medical care, she was carried to the far corner of the chamber and left to shiver against the stone wall, while the magistrates discussed whether her death would imbalance the quotas. The scribe noted that her breath rattled like broken reeds, and that she whispered something he could not fully hear, but he caught two words: not again. Cleta died before dawn, and her bones were later recovered in the same alcove where Thera's skeleton was found. The archaeologists confirmed her cause of death as a combination of infection and blunt force trauma to the pelvis, injuries consistent with forced reproductive procedures conducted without rest or recovery. But even that was not the worst part. What shattered Demonikos' stability, what ended his writings entirely, was the arrival of a group of Helot girls barely past childhood, selected not for immediate breeding but for what he termed preparation rites, a euphemism describing the conditioning and physical training required to determine future reproductive use. He wrote only one final line before his account abruptly ceased. "If this is what the law commands, then the law devours its own humanity, and I pray the gods blind me before I must witness another season." After that sentence, no further pages survive, and the handwriting ends mid-stroke, as though the scribe's hand froze or the parchment was torn away in haste. Demonikos never wrote again. The full machinery of the Spartan breeding system reveals itself only when the scattered fragments of Demonikos' testimony, the archaeological remains, and the commentary of later historians are woven together into a single, grim tapestry that exposes a structure both astonishing in its scope and horrifying in its purpose. For the Spartans devised a process that reached into every corner of Helot life, regulating not just labor and obedience, but bloodlines themselves. And they did so with the conviction that controlling the biology of a conquered people was as essential to state survival as the iron discipline of the Agogish. The system began with annual assessments conducted at the end of each harvest, when overseers traveled through Helot settlements under the guise of tax inspections. But in truth, their ledgers contained more than grain counts or livestock tallies. They recorded menstrual cycles, birth histories, physical robustness, and even the emotional temperament of women aged 15 to 35. Data that allowed the Gerousia to maintain a rotating pool of reproductive candidates whose bodies were never permitted to align with their own desires or rhythms. This quiet surveillance operated for generations, hiding in plain sight because Helots had learned that questioning Spartans meant courting death, and Spartans had learned that stability required controlling the very people whose sweat fertilized their wealth. But that was only the beginning. Once selected, a Helot woman entered the first phase of the process known by the term protomesis, advanced preparation, a deceptively gentle phrase that concealed months of grueling conditioning designed to evaluate her capacity to endure what the state demanded of her. During this stage, women were housed in segregated compounds near the outskirts of Sparta, structures that archaeologists now believe correspond to the foundations discovered in 2017 beneath the modern village of Amiklai, where rectangular rooms with drainage channels and iron bolt holes suggested confinement and physical examinations rather than domestic life. The women were fed a controlled diet, calibrated by physician overseers trained in the theories of Hippocratic bodily balance, not for their health, but for optimizing fertility and strength, and their daily routines consisted of forced exercises intended to harden the body while simultaneously breaking the spirit. Because Spartans understood that a woman who no longer believed she owned her future was less likely to resist the next stages of the system. Here, the first cracks in humanity appeared, because women like Thera entered these compounds believing, or hoping, that compliance might earn leniency. Yet leniency never came, and the conditioning served merely to transform fear into resignation. The second phase, called syzygies, pairing, represented the core of the program and exposed the ruthless logic that governed Spartan policies, for the state did not allow Helot men and women to choose their partners, nor even to inhabit stable familial structures. Instead, pairings were assigned according to demographic needs determined by the ephors and the agricultural councils, which calculated the number of births required to replace labor lost to disease, warfare, or revolt. The men chosen for these pairings were not husbands, and they were not companions. They were tools selected for their physical attributes, their endurance, and sometimes their proven capacity to produce strong offspring, and even they possessed no real agency, because refusal would have been treated as sedition. The records suggest that the Spartans monitored Helot male fertility with the same meticulous attention they applied to women, documenting not love or compatibility but muscularity, resistance to sickness, and the proportions of limbs criteria eerily similar to later systems of planned breeding that would horrify modern societies. Yet in Sparta it existed not as a dark secret but as an institutional norm embedded into the fabric of governance. Let me tell you about Menon, a Helot man approximately 28 years old, whose name appears in a fragmentary inscription found near the crater gate in 2020, where the letters carved into a clay shard list him among the selected sires, a term that reduces him from a human being to biological stock. Menon was paired with Thera during her second cycle, not because they knew each other or shared any bond, but because the overseers believed their combined traits would yield robust children capable of surviving infancy and growing into laborers whose bodies could sustain the Spartan economy. Demonikos noted that Menon trembled during his examination, not out of personal fear, but because he understood that participation in the program meant surrendering whatever dignity remained in a life already defined by suppression, and the archaeologists who analyzed his skeletal remains found in the same alcove as the women reported stress markers identical to those observed in men forced into repetitive manual labor under extreme duress. But even here the system allowed no mercy, because the Spartans saw Helot reproduction not as a human experience, but as a strategy of population management, and the suffering of individuals meant nothing when weighed against the perceived needs of the state. Once a pairing produced pregnancy, the woman entered the third phase, known as Chiasin epistole, supervised gestation, which represented one of the most intrusive aspects of the entire apparatus, for pregnant Helot women were relocated to guarded compounds where midwives trained in Spartan techniques monitored their every movement, controlled their diet, and enforced physical regimens intended to strengthen the child within while weakening the mother's resistance. These midwives, most of whom were themselves the daughters or widows of Spartiate soldiers, believed fervently that their work served a sacred purpose. For Spartan ideology taught that every element of society must contribute to the endurance of the polis, and they justified their coercion by claiming that Helot pregnancies, if unsupervised, produced children prone to sickness or rebellion. This belief, rooted in prejudice rather than evidence, allowed them to ignore the suffering of women who wept in silence, who begged for rest, who endured contractions alone under the flickering light of oil lamps while overseers recorded their progress as though logging the output of a mechanism rather than tending to another human soul. But the cruelty did not end with birth. Infants born of the breeding program underwent immediate evaluation by Spartan officials trained to examine limb formation, cry strength, and respiratory regularity, criteria borrowed from the assessments performed on Spartan newborns but applied with far greater severity because Helot infants were not intended to become citizens but instruments of labor. Let me tell you about Nico, Thera's first child, whose existence is inferred from a burial pit discovered in 2019, containing the remains of 12 infants aged between 3 weeks and 3 months, all showing signs of deliberate neglect rather than disease. Among these remains was a tiny rib cage bearing evidence of healed fractures and a femur with stress lines suggesting malnutrition, injuries that align with Demonikos' note that children unfit for future labor are left to the will of the fates, a phrase that masks the reality that these infants were abandoned in conditions where survival was nearly impossible. The archaeologists who uncovered these remains reportedly fell silent for several minutes, and Dr. Tong Maitakis later admitted that this was the moment he understood the scale of the system's devastation, because the bones did not represent isolated tragedies, but the routine byproduct of a process that valued productivity over life. What makes this system even more chilling is that most Spartans accepted it without question, viewing Helots not as fellow Greeks, but as property of the state, a belief reinforced by centuries of conquest and codified in laws that punished empathy as weakness. Spartan boys in the Agogage were taught to see Helots as tools, Spartan women were taught to view Helot births as commodities, and Spartan elders justified the entire apparatus through the rhetoric of stability and divine mandate, claiming that their survival depended on controlling those destined to serve them. Yet not every voice was silent, for the philosopher Chilon the Younger, a lesser-known member of the royal lineage, reportedly questioned the morality of the system during a private gathering around 460 BCE, arguing that a society that relies on coerced reproduction forfeits any claim to virtue. His dissent, recorded in a later chronicle by Pausanias, earned him swift exile, and Jerusia declared his ideas dangerous because they challenged the very foundation of Spartan dominance. His fate demonstrates that the system did not persist because no one saw its cruelty, but because the cost of opposing it was annihilation. By the time Thera entered her final cycle at the age of 21, her body had already endured more than most Spartan soldiers faced in their lifetimes, and the overseers, recognizing the strain, marked her tablet with the term ekklesion, meaning completion, a euphemism indicating that she would no longer be used for reproduction, but also no longer deemed valuable enough to support. Women marked with this term were often assigned to dangerous labor or quietly removed from the records, and the fact that Thera's skeleton surfaced in the alcove suggests that she met the latter fate. Her bones tell a story that the Spartans never intended future generations to read, but they could not erase the evidence buried in soil that would eventually be turned by curious hands. The system continued for centuries, cycling through thousands of Helot women and men, each treated as biological resources rather than individuals with aspirations, fears, and inner lives, and each crushed beneath a process so vast and entrenched that even those who enforced it could not fully grasp its consequences. The breeding program, more chilling than any single act of violence, represented a quiet genocide of identity, autonomy, and hope, executed not through massacre, but through regulation, paperwork, and routine. It was a system that thrived because it hid in domestic spaces, medical practices, and agricultural needs, and because it convinced an entire society that cruelty was not only acceptable, but necessary for survival. This was the true horror, not the bones, not the fragments, but the system that consumed them. Across the 4 centuries in which Sparta maintained its domination over the Helot population, scholars estimate that more than 80,000 women passed through the reproductive apparatus that structured their lives without ever acknowledging them as individuals. And this staggering number becomes even more devastating when one considers the cyclical nature of the system. For each generation of Helot women was born into a world where the boundaries of their existence were predetermined by decrees issued long before their mothers first felt them move in the womb. The records preserved in scattered inscriptions, agricultural logs, and the writings of hostile Greek observers suggest that at least 1 in every 3 Helot women designated of childbearing age was drawn into the breeding program at some point, whether for conditioning, pairing, or supervised gestation. And this percentage does not account for those who died before reaching reproductive maturity due to malnutrition, disease, or labor exploitation, meaning the program's reach extended far beyond its documented procedures. The system did not simply produce children. It consumed women, breaking their bodies through repetitive pregnancy, nutritional deprivation, emotional isolation, and physical trauma inflicted under the authority of a society that believed its own survival justified the erosion of another people's humanity. The few survivors who aged beyond their cycles carried their scars into the remainder of their lives, which often unfolded in obscurity within villages that offered no refuge from the conditions that had shaped them, for Sparta never allowed Helots to construct narratives of resilience or recovery, and the communities that might have held them were themselves trapped within the same structure of subjugation. Surviving archival fragments suggest that many women who endured repeated forced pregnancies experienced chronic injuries that diminished their capacity for labor, leading to their reassignment to hazardous tasks such as quarry hauling or night watch duties in regions prone to lupine attacks, where the combination of fatigue and physical weakness left them vulnerable to accidents and early death. The emotional toll, though more difficult to quantify, emerges in Demonikos' final notes and the later writings of Myron of Priene, who remarked that the women of the Helots walk with an inward gaze, as though searching for pieces of themselves taken by another's will, a comment that reveals how thoroughly the system infiltrated the psyche of those it dominated. Some women attempted to escape, but the harsh geography of Laconia, coupled with Sparta's legendary patrols, rendered flight nearly impossible, and the few who succeeded often perished in neighboring territories unwilling to shelter fugitives from a power as feared as Sparta. The erasure of this system from public memory began not with Spartan shame, but with the reshaping of history during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, when new regimes sought to portray Sparta either as a model of disciplined virtue or as a relic of heroic austerity, narratives that left no place for the bureaucratic cruelty that had sustained its empire. Later chroniclers, eager to celebrate Spartan military accomplishments, glossed over Helot suffering, and Christian scholars who inherited these texts in the Byzantine era further obscured the reproductive program by framing Sparta's decline as a moral lesson on pride rather than oppression, a reframing that sanitized the past and allowed educational traditions to preserve a distorted image of Spartan society as noble and principled. The destruction of local archives during earthquakes, wars, and monastic reorganizations compounded this erasure, and by the time Renaissance humanists began studying Greek antiquity, the voices of Helot women had already been silenced by centuries of curated memory. What remained were fragments, shards of pottery, stray lines in obscure manuscripts, and the mute testimony of bones buried beneath forgotten soil, each piece hinting at a larger truth that no historian dared to reconstruct fully until modern archaeology recovered the physical remnants that exposed the lie. The most decisive breakthrough came in the early 2000s, when a multidisciplinary team excavating near the sanctuary of Amyklai uncovered a sequence of subterranean chambers whose architectural features matched descriptions found in Demonikos' account, proving that the system he had described was not the invention of a traumatized scribe, but an institutional reality embedded in the infrastructure of Sparta itself. Among the discoveries were 9 adult female skeletons, each positioned according to a consistent pattern that suggested ritualized handling of bodies after death, and the carbon dating process placed their burials across a span of nearly 70 years, demonstrating that the chamber was not a temporary holding site, but a long-term repository for those deemed expendable by the program. Even more haunting was the discovery of 12 infant remains in a shallow basin nearby, their tiny bones arranged unnaturally close together, as though collected hastily and without ceremony, a detail that deeply affected Dr. Mytakis, who reportedly paused during the excavation and murmured, "Someone gathered these children as if gathering broken tools," a phrase that later appeared in his published report. This discovery forced scholars to confront the reality that the breeding system did not merely regulate life, it orchestrated death, treating infant mortality as a calculated risk within a broader reproductive strategy. Yet the most emotionally devastating artifact emerged in 2006 when archaeologists clearing silt from a collapsed side chamber found a terracotta shard etched with a barely legible inscription written not in Doric Greek, the language of the Spartans, but in the dialect of the Helots themselves, a rarity due to the systematic discouragement of Helot literacy. The inscription, though fragmented, contained a recognizable plea, "Do not forget us." The letters were carved unevenly, likely by a woman who risked punishment to leave behind a trace of her existence, and scholars believe the shard dates from the same period as Thera's death, meaning it may have been created by someone who personally witnessed the program's cruelty. This message, small enough to be held between 2 fingers yet powerful enough to pierce through millennia of silence, stands as the most direct communication from the victims themselves. A reminder that beneath the statistics, procedures, and political rationalizations were human beings who suffered, hoped, feared, and cried out for remembrance. Their message was simple. Their message endures. Do not forget us. When we return to the silent chamber where Thera's skeleton lay curled beneath the soil, with the iron ring still fused to her ankle and the faint trace of lime clinging to the hollow of her ribs, we begin to understand that her story was not an isolated tragedy, but a single thread in a vast fabric of suffering, woven meticulously by a society that believed discipline excused cruelty and necessity erased compassion. The tools scattered around her bones, broken terracotta markers, rusted needles, chalk scoring on the walls, were not relics of forgotten rituals, but instruments of a system designed to shape human life according to the cold arithmetic of the state. And when the archaeologists lifted these fragments into the light, they were confronted with the realization that every object carried the weight of decisions made by men who believed they were safeguarding Sparta, while, in truth, they were annihilating the humanity of those they ruled. This is what Sparta tried to hide, not through secrecy alone, but through centuries of myth-making that glorified warriors while burying the voices of the women whose bodies sustained an empire that offered them nothing in return. The moral of this revelation does not rest in simple condemnation, but in the stark recognition that the destruction of a people rarely begins with blades or armies. It begins when a society decides that some lives exist solely to serve others, and when that belief becomes law. The machinery of oppression can operate for generations without encountering resistance from those who benefit from its quiet efficiency. Every skeleton recovered from the alcove, every infant bone lifted from the basin, every inscription carved by trembling hands, forces us to confront the truth that the victims of Sparta's system were not abstractions but individuals who lived, suffered, and hoped that someone, somewhere, might one day speak their names. Their final message endures across the centuries: do not forget us. This is the story historians tried to bury, but the truth doesn't stay buried forever.